So happy for you to unshare the screen, and then I can start with a very brief introduction. People are still joining the call, but given the very limited time, we have 1 hour for this session, it's good to start. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this third session of the Earth Systems Governance SDG Taskforce Roundtable series, which is focused on the topic of subnational initiatives for SDG implementation. My name is Shirin Malekpour, and I'm an associate professor at Monash Sustainable Development Institute at Monash University. I'm joining this webinar today from Melbourne, Australia. And before I talk any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm living and pay my respect to their elders past and present. I'll be chairing the session today, but the session has been co-organized with my colleagues, Dr. Basil Bornemann from the University of Basel, Switzerland, and Dr. Dominique from Monash Sustainable Development Institute at Monash University. Just a brief note for those who might not be very familiar with the roundtable series of the Earth System Governance SDG Task Force. This roundtable series focus on the promises and pitfalls of accelerating SDG implementation at different levels. So by levels, I mean the first roundtable, for example, really focused on issues of global and international governance. The second one focused on implementation of the SDGs at the national level. And this session today, which is the third session of the series, is explicitly exploring subnational implementation of the SDGs, which in our definition includes translation and localization processes, as well as emerging governance arrangements and their impacts. Through this session, we hope to really support a dialogue between research and practice to really unpack issues in relation to local SDG implementation, reflect on the experiences so far, and also explore critical factors for successful initiatives in the remaining time that we have until 2030, which is the deadline we have for achieving the SDGs. I'll explain more about the session, but firstly, very briefly, just the format of how we are running the session today. At the very start, my colleague Basil will briefly talk about our work in the SDG Taskforce of Earth System Governance on subnational initiatives for SDG implementation. After that, we will hear from our 5 panelists who come together in this session from different parts of the world with different experiences, both in academia, but also in practice in regards to SDG implementation at the subnational level. We will hear about their reflections on the work they have been doing, and also their insights into how we should move forward in the remaining times that we have. In the end, we will also have time for Q&A, but I suggest that everyone participating in today's session and all the audience to feel free to put your questions in the Q&A chat and the chat box below, because at the end we will try to kind of like collate all the questions and try to ask them from our panelists. So during the interventions we're hearing from panelists, we will not have much time for Q&A, but we will try to leave everything for the end. So feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go. Really, to start, I will want to hand over to my colleague Basil to really kick us off with a very brief introduction of our working group on subnational initiatives for SDG implementation in the SDG Task Force. And after that, we will head directly to the panel discussion. So Basil, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Shirin, for this introduction. Very briefly, only from my side, some notes on the working group Subnational Initiatives for SDG Implementation, which is a working group within the Earth System Governance Task Force on the SDGs. And I would like also to use this as an advertisement to invite you, and possibly there are interested people would like to join this working group on subnational initiatives. So please get in touch with us if you feel attracted to what we are doing. You can just go to the next slide. This is the current group we are working in. So it's not only Shirin, Domi, and myself, but some other people that you can see here from Australia, but also from other places around the world. And we are, as I said, looking forward to also have more people joining this group. You can continue, Domi. This is what we are looking at a little bit in this very schematic way. Shirin already pointed to some implementation challenges that regularly occur on the subnational level, which is the focus that we are taking. So we are really interested in what is going on below the national level and what is and how the subnational level both on the government side, but also the broader governance sphere, the subnational governance sphere, including the local level, how this is embedded into kind of a broader framework of governance through global goals on the one hand, but we are also very much interested what emerges really from the ground up in terms of subnational initiatives and how they tie into kind of this broader framework of SDG implementation. As already indicated, we conceptualize these implementation challenges that we see here as challenges of localization, but also challenges of domestication, that some external kind of goals meet internal goals and need to be adapted internally. But as we all know, there's already a history of sustainability governance and activities at different levels, and so therefore it might also be a challenge of transformation and alignment that we are looking at when we look at the subnational implementation of the SDGs. You can continue with the next slide. So these are some activities that we do. We took part in kind of drawing a scoping paper on stated perspectives of SDG implementation. I could say some more words on that, but I leave it with that. Currently, we are drafting a paper on leveraging SDG implementation at the subnational level, but we have further plans, for example, a case study collection and a comparison of cases that could be compiled in a special issue. But and also we steadily think about common research project proposals, but this is certainly something that can be developed further. As Shirin already indicated at the beginning, and this roundtable is an expression of this last set of activities that we're doing, that we are also very much interested in conducting dialogue and engagement with experts and with the broader public. And we think also about kind of, putting this together in some form of lessons learned, practical lessons learned for SDG implementation into a policy paper. And this roundtable today is certainly an element in this kind of activity that is more beyond the academic work, and so reaching out really to practice and getting things going. That's so far for our working group. And as I said, please get in touch with us, write us an email, and we are happy to join if you joined us. We look forward to meeting you again in the future.
Thank you so much. Great. So I think we are ready to head to the panel. So on our panel today, we have 5 speakers that, as I mentioned before, really come from a mix of backgrounds, both academic and scientific. They bring both academic and scientific perspectives, but also practice and implementation perspective really into the discussion today. So in no particular order, we have Professor Brett Bryan from Deakin University in Australia. We have Dr. Dianty Ningrum from Monash Sustainable Development Institute in Australia. We have Maurice Christen, who heads the network for cantonal sustainability offices in Switzerland. We have Rebecca Purba from UNSCAP based in Bangkok. And we also have Dr. Jessica SP from University of Bristol in the UK. So really people coming from different parts of the world and sharing their perspectives. And I'd like to first start with Dr. Jessica Espy to really kick us off with her reflections on the work she has been doing so far on subnational SDG implementation. And really by thinking about those experiences so far, provide some overview of what you have seen as different ways of SDG implementation at the subnational level so far, and what are the kind of factors that you consider as being conducive to successful implementation? And if you could also name one key enabler and one key challenge that you have observed in your work for us, that would be really wonderful. And then everyone else on the panel will also reflect on their experiences in the same way. So Jessica, over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Basil and Shirin. It's lovely to be here. My name is Jessica Espy. I'm the University of Bristol, but I should say that I'm a relatively recent academic. I worked for the UN or with the UN for close to 15 years. Last as a director of a research institute called the SDSN, which was a sort of global network of research and knowledge centers working in support of the SDGs. And so in that capacity, I worked a lot on subnational implementation of the SDGs, was very involved in the negotiations themselves on SDG 11. And after we agreed SDG 11, one of the things I was most interested in is actually exactly some of the questions that Basil raised. How will this be adapted and kind of, appropriated in a good way at the subnational level and customized to tailor to different contexts? But my broader area of research is around governance. And so with that, I sort of, I wanted to focus in on a theme that I think has been very relevant in all of my different projects around subnational implementation. And I did pretty hands-on projects in over 12 cities worldwide from 2015 to 2019. And then more recently, I've been working a lot with global urban stakeholders. And across sort of all of that work, there's been this sort of nugget, if you will, of common kind of interest and reflection and common sort of challenges, if you will, at the different subnational level. So what I wanted to talk about now is around the use of expert knowledge, and specifically how, if you're trying to accelerate progress on the SDGs subnationally, you can lean on and turn to and use different expert knowledge hubs, centers, individuals in order to support subnational implementation, and particularly the role that these actors can play in accelerating progress. And I think there are three key things that I've observed from working in a real range of places, be that in Cotonou in Benin or in Brazil, or working in the US and the UK and so on. And these three observations are as follows. So the first is really that, as everyone on this call knows, probably far better than me, the complexity of urban change and the complexity of urban systems is such that by the time you finally get around to implementing something, working with local government or national government, you're often behind the curve, right? The dynamics are moving so fast, and population change is so rapid. And as we've seen with COVID and loads of other different forms of non-communicable diseases, things are just changing so dynamically at the urban scale that it's very, very, very hard for policymakers, however adept they may be and have a well-resourced or challenged in the resourcing department, to keep pace with designing interventions and designing solutions for sustainable development challenges that are going to be kind of commensurate with the scale of the challenges and the complexity of those challenges. And so I particularly found, for example, I was doing work in Baltimore, that the local city administration was trying to work on this sort of urban redevelopment, housing development scheme in a certain part of the city. And by the time they finally got to actually implementing the work, all the residents were saying, well, no, you completely missed the fact that actually our biggest concern right now is not the quality of the infrastructure, it's to do with crime. So things just move so dynamically. And so one of the things that I've observed in really successful cases is where there are very clear partnerships between local administrators and city officials or other subnational representatives with local researchers. Now, I hasten from saying, as much as I sit in a university and sort of, I would love to say every city in the world should have a partnership with a university somewhere, that's not always the case, because often a lot of that expert knowledge comes from civil society groups who are, for example, generating citizen-generated data. It might come from other indigenous knowledge systems. So I think the point is that the expert knowledge can be curated from a wide variety of sources, but that there is a clear partnership and interface with the local city officials and local administrations to work with and curate knowledge from these from these non-governmental sources, recognizing that however well capacitated they may be, they will not be able to keep pace with the speed of urban change. And so those kinds of partnerships are incredibly important. And I'm going to put a link in the chat in a minute to one project that we did from, I think, 2017 to 2020 when I was at SDSN, which had a range of different case study cities, and all of those kind of reaffirm this point, and I think quite interesting. Oh, thank you. Domi's already posted it. Thanks, Domi. The second thing, and very much related to that, is I've been so impressed at the cities I've noticed and observed and subnational authorities I've worked with that have been really proactively trying to use new forms of data and information. And, that doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly high tech. That's not necessarily shiny gizmos and smart city techs and, data collecting benches as they have in places like LA. It could also be things as simple as actually trying to get local officials to be much better at using publicly available resources like Landsat, giving them real sort of quite simple techniques, or working with local partners to try and identify actually how you can geocode lots of information across the city, or how you can think about sort of spatial mapping of different instances at the subnational level. And I think we've seen time and time again in so many different examples that where even those basic kind of updates of twinning any of the information that the city's generating in their administrative data with readily available free resources like Landsat imagery, or other large-scale censuses or surveys that might be being compiled either by the national government or by third parties, groups like Flowminder at the University of Southampton, who are developing amazingly robust sort of census alternatives. It can be really, really powerful in helping to design much more targeted and sort of aware information. The third thing I just wanted to mention related to all of this is really the importance of knowledge intermediaries. And when I say that, I mean, my work, as I said before, is very much focused on global governance of sustainable development today. And I work a lot on UN reform and looking at kind of how we can use evidence systems. I have to pause and apologize. I have a small infant in the background who has just appeared. I did explain to the organisers I had a slight childcare issue this morning, so apologies for that. He's meant to be diverted by TV, but it's not worked. Anyway, I'm going to keep going, so apologies for that. The third point I was just going to say was around knowledge intermediaries, and particularly the fact that I found time and time again that working with NSO groups, but also with academics or think tanks, can be incredibly helpful at taking and customizing the kinds of information you need and trying to make it more relevant for local governments. So at SDSN, that was very much our role. We were a secretariat or a group of actors who were working with academics to try and curate the most relevant information and convey it to the policymakers for whatever challenge they might have at that given moment in time. And I don't think we can underestimate the importance of that function. All of the modern literature from policy studies and political science really emphasizes that, to affect evidence-informed policy and to try and influence policy design and change, you really need to make sure that you're kind of curating information that's readily accessible for policymakers. So I think that that's another really crucial function that we've seen time and time again in different city contexts. I'm going to pause there, not least of all because of the noise disturbance, but thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to having a chance to answer some Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jessica, and so impressive that you could still continue at a very fast speed despite the interruption you had. Excellent. Really great insights, particularly at the city or urban level, and the particular challenges of urban development and SDG implementation. I want to hand over to Professor Brett Bryan, who has also worked on SDG implementation at the subnational level, but perhaps at a scale smaller than city level, really looking at regional areas, small towns, and sharing his reflections on what he has seen as successful or success factors in implementing the SDGs at that level.
Thanks, Shirin, and thanks everybody. Great to be here. Yeah, so my experience has been part of a research group looking at what we called the local SDGs project. So it was a philanthropically funded research project, quite significant, over about 4 years or even longer now. But we focused on, in particular, 2 specific local areas. One was a town called Forest in an ecologically significant part of southern Australia, also hit by tourism, one of the most tourist-intensive regions of the world. I forget the name of it. Great Ocean Road. There you go. It's too late in the day. So very, very heavy post-agricultural landscape, but they were dealing an important water catchment area, but they were dealing with things like homelessness and poverty and things like that within this small town. So very complex socio-ecological issues. The second region was an irrigation district in northern Victoria. So this is one of the most productive agricultural regions in Australia, yet had suffered decline in the dairy industry because of water policy and water buybacks for the environment. The environment was struggling due to decades of over-extraction and got other sort of social and economic issues there as well. There's two other small study areas we've also worked with that are informative, and that was one is the Tiwi Islands. The issues there, it's islands off the north coast of Australia, Indigenous owned and managed. Issues there were things like ecosystem management, biodiversity conservation, fire and climate change. And the fourth was a local council in urban Melbourne called Marybeck. And their focus, they were worried about climate change and particularly SDG 13 and how they would adapt to particularly vulnerable citizens in that region. So these 4 areas have come together and doing hands-on, on-ground projects with local people, looking at local issues to try and understand how what the local priorities for SDGs were, in particular going to working with local people and asking them, engaging with locals, using participatory methods and innovative methods to elicit information, to co-produce knowledge with locals about what's important to them at the local level. And almost in every case, each region had its own, I guess, sort of sustainability nomenclature or framework that they were interested in. So in Forest, it was more about sort of sustainable development and issues of poverty, homelessness, sustainable development, but in a developed country context. In the agriculture context region, it was more about resilience. So they were interested in sustainability, but they called it resilience, and resilience into the future and resilient economies and so on. Tiwi's more about Indigenous conservation and climate change, and Marybeck was about climate adaptation. So we're dealing with very different aspects of the SDGs. And they might be called different things, but so I guess one of the keys that is front of mind for me is to use the SDGs as a framing concept, but to tailor those discussions around sustainability to align with the local ideas and priorities of sustainability, whether that's resilience or climate adaptation or whatever. So you've got to be a little bit flexible, not come in with your own framework. Oh, every country in the world has signed up to these goals. We need to talk in terms of these goals. Well, no. We've been working, here in this local area for a long time using resilience or whatever it is. So you've got to be much more receptive to and flexible to local ideas. Got to do your homework. So don't come in green, you've got to understand the context. And we've done this through extensive literature reviews of over hundreds of reports that have been done on the Goulburn Murray agriculture, the irrigation district that we did. We've done local interviews of people, in-depth interviews and so on, to get a handle on what's going on locally. Then social ecological systems, these sustainability systems are complex. Models can help us understand the system. So we need to build models, and we use systems dynamics models, which integrate all aspects of society, the economy, the environment, and different sectors, multiple sectors, housing, agriculture, land use, the economy, water, biodiversity, etc. And then once you build these models, you can understand how the system works, and you build it using knowledge co-produced with local people. Ask the locals how things work there, because they know way better than you do, because inevitably you're coming into a region as an outsider. There's a local richness, there's local ecological knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge that you need to tap into. And also co-produce knowledge on what can be done, what solutions are available to us at the local level. No one knows better about what can be done to make things, make the future better than the past than local people. But don't rely entirely on models to communicate. It's no good to go in there with the results of your complex modelling and your trends into the future of key SDG indicators and targets and things with your uncertainty bands and whatever. That doesn't mean much to local people. Tell the story, understand the narrative, build a richness around what the quantitative data and the models are telling you, and make it accessible to them. So I just finish on an enabler and a challenge, Shirin, if I can. So one enabler is to use trusted local champions. So again, as an outsider, you're at a disadvantage. People don't trust you. They don't know you. They don't think you understand the region. So we've used local community groups in the Tiwis. We've employed local rangers and local Indigenous people. In Marybeck, we had a climate adaptation champion. In the Goulburn Murray, we used a local consulting firm that had worked with the community a lot before. Use local champions as your insider. And then one challenge, I think, is that people are fatigued by consultation. They're struggling, that they might have been parts of these processes for a long time. They're struggling with the immediacies of life and work and kids and whatever, and they have limited bandwidth for concepts that are complex, they're uncertain, and they're long term. So we've found it hard to just the nature of the SDGs problems, long term, perceived as being long term, and not immediately impacting my everyday life. So it's easy to put on the back burner. So yeah, that's enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad. Really great insights, particularly really coming from that bottom-up community-focused perspective, as opposed to some of the work that some of us do here, which is more policy-focused and really going from the other side to tackle the issue. On that, I want to hand over to Dr. Dianty Ningrum. Unlike many of us here who have been doing some work before the SDGs, and then when the SDGs came about, we just got really interested in it and tried to really engage with the SDGs as a framework. Dianty actually did her PhD on SDG implementation at the local level. So I think she has very rich insights as to what it takes to do a good local implementation. Over to you, Dianty.
Thanks, Shirin. Can everyone hear me just fine? Good, great. First of all, thanks Shirin and Basil and also Domi for arranging, and thanks everyone for having me today. So just quickly go straight into the the talks that I'm aware of the time here. I'm Dianty Ningrum. Like Shirin has just explained, I just finished my PhD basically in local actions for the SDGs. Basically, my research are looking at three things: how local government engage with the SDGs, what enable local SDG actions, and different perspective of what enable SDG actions. So before I go into the prompts that Shirin has given, maybe it's I want to mention two contexts that I'm coming from. So the first of all, I'm looking at SDG implementation in subnational, specifically on local government engagement. So I'm looking at, in my research, I'm looking at 16 local governments in Australia and how they engage with the SDGs and different types and different types of actions. And also the implementations that we're talking about here, maybe more specifically in my research, I look into SDG actions and engagement. So my understanding is implementation is a part of actions and engagement. So in order to implement SDG, you may need to engage with it in multiple ways. And what I have been observing during my research is that these SDG engagement, these local governments are engaging with the SDGs in various activities in local governance, including visioning, strategy, delivering on actions, and also monitoring and reporting. So the idea of this implementation can actually manifest in different types of activities and actions in local governments. So in terms of what makes a successful implementations of SDG implementations at subnational and local government and specifically, I guess aside from actual meaningful achievement of SDG goals and target, which I think have been discussed before by Jessica and Brett and also Shirin briefly, I also want to bring the discussions of a process and specifically transformative process a little bit. Because the research that I've been doing, we observed that a successful implementation of the local SDGs demand a simultaneously a process that it demands fostering a process of transformation through engaging with the SDGs. So of course, by now we acknowledge that SDG implementation at all levels is not a linear and isolated process. So in order for it to have a more widespread and more meaningful impact, it needs to be transformative. So by transformative, we mean that it gives sort of a leverage in the system it is operating that leads to a bigger and greater change, not only for that specific subnational area or like local government area, but also other level and other scales. So what, like, if we want to enable one enabler of this successful implementations, honestly, it's quite difficult because we found in our research that there's quite a number of enablers that works in different contexts, and different local governments with different capacities can prioritize different enablers. But maybe if I can name some of them that are most frequently being observed in my research, is first of all, constant and reliable resource. Others are also things such as conducive policy making and planning structure, reliable partnership, competent local actors, which I specifically want to highlight here, is this competent local actor, which I see in my research here as someone like a SDG champion, because during my research, we found that actually the local government and local councils that engage with the SDGs are not only those that we consider as like front runners or like local government with high profiles, but actually smaller and, for example, local council in the more regional areas, they also have quite an interest and appetite for SDG engagement. But most of them do not really have an access to like a guideline or resources to engage with the SDGs in some of the ways in which those front runners are doing, like NYC or State of Melbourne, for example. So they've been doing that in their own way, in their own capacities and contexts, like what Brett also mentioned. It can be in terms of partnership, it can be in terms of like having them in community vision. It can be like in terms of having sort of like an ad hoc, their own way of SDG database that may not be considered a fully, you know, data-based, fully, you know, high-tech SDG database, but also something that still can be useful for sustainability, for measuring sustainability impact at the local level. So I think the challenge is to consolidate actions and results among ongoing implementations across all of these different types of implementation and engagement. So a lot of local and subnational entities, they're doing SDG actions at different stages with different capacities and contexts. And I think one of the challenges that we can highlight is how to consolidate them and make them like they can share knowledge, they can share experience with each other, and also leverage each other in the process. I'll stop here and give the space back to Shirin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dianty. It's really great to hear your reflections out of 3-4 years of research on this topic. And I'm really glad that you also mentioned at the start that notion of transformations and doing things at a transformative level. What happened to our Zoom participants?
Oh, they're all coming back now. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah.
Zoom just kicked everyone out.
Maybe we'll give it a few seconds so that everyone joins back.
That's nearly everyone now.
Okay, great. Sorry, everyone. We don't know what happened, but since we are all back, I was just mentioning that I'm really glad that Dianty also mentioned that notion of transformations, and also thinking about what does it mean to have more transformative local implementation, because we are really arguing in our research communities that this kind of thinking is also really required in the next half of the SDG timeline that we have left, if we are really going to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And also really appreciate your comment, Dianty, on the fact that there are different enablers that are needed in different contexts, and really depending on who are the actors we are talking about and engaging in implementation, what are the resources and capacities that are available, different enablers will be needed. That also really ties with the comments that Brett had before around tailored approaches in different contexts. So on that note, I want to now hand over to Jessica Purba, who is joining us from Bangkok and is a member of UN SCAP and is really supporting a lot of the cities and local authorities in the Asia Pacific on the topic of SDG implementation. So really keen to hear your reflections, Rebecca.
Thank you, Shirin. Thank you, everyone. Greetings from Bangkok. I'm Rebecca, originally from Indonesia, but working specifically for the Asia Pacific region with the United Nations SCAP. So maybe I can provide a little bit of overview. Some of you might have been engaged with UN SCAP before, but I think it will help kind of frame my sharing of today as well. So at SCAP, which stands for Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, it's basically an intergovernmental platform with around 53 member states that basically, same with the rest of other UN organizations, the pursuit is for sustainable development. But specifically at SCAP, we do 3 things, which is generating action-oriented like knowledge or like products, knowledge product. And then we provide technical assistance. And the last one is on the capacity building services. And we do this both for local government, national government, and also finally building it up to the regional agreements. But if I may ask Dom to share my screen. So specifically, I work with the Environment and Development Division, but under the Cities for a Sustainable Future. This is the section that I actually work on. So here, there are lots of content, but I think I would like to highlight the 4 big chunk, which is first one is the SDG localization and voluntary local reviews. We have Asia Pacific Urban Forum, which also will take place this year, actually, in Suwon, Republic of Korea. We have the Urban Gateway, which has basically all of this knowledge, but kind of combined into sort of like a playbook or a textbook, if you might want to say the shape of delivery. And then the last one on the right-hand column, which is a list of the projects that we've been working on to date. in terms of inclusive, low carbon, resilient, smart, and sustainable cities. But if I may draw your attention to the first part, which is on the SDG localization and then volunteer local reviews, I think to answer Shirin's question in terms of main enabler and main challenge, I think when it comes to the Asia Pacific region, it is very diverse. And then the SDG progress is also very diverse. Perhaps some of you might have seen the recent 2023 SDG progress, which is a review on, I think there's a global version, but also there's the regional version of Asia Pacific, and most goals were not on track for delivery by 2030. So at the half year mark, we're not there yet. There were some goals that might have been before COVID kind of nearing where it should be, but then now it's mostly off track. And even for SDG 13, I believe there's lots of regression on that area. And so I think when it comes to the SDG localization, taking a even deeper look at national and also local context, at ESCAP, we also do a lot of voluntary local reviews. We've been doing this for quite a while. Back in 2019, before the pandemic, we developed the first regional guidelines on developing voluntary local reviews, which I believe also Monash University has adopted to create a playbook on the VLR to help with the Pacific cities. So it's exciting to see a lot of this effort are coming together, and not just several cities doing it, but the scale is also, in terms of volume, is increasing. So I think if I were to share the enablers when it comes to voluntary local review, I think for the most part, when we talk to local governments or subnational governments, everyone is already sort of aware, even though perhaps the word SDGs might be new, or the 17 goals or the targets and indicators are a bit specific, but everyone has already been working on sustainable development within the local government, right? They have the development planning, they have the long-term, short-term, medium-term development planning. So we're sort of talking in the same language, and it's not like convincing them to onboard a new goal. So in terms of the main enabler, I think the bigger vision is already the same. But I think when it comes to the main challenge, since the vision is the same, the main challenge is actually on the ownership, because everyone is kind of working on it at the same time. But then who owns which part of this, for instance, in the VLR process, right? The data is owned by so many stakeholders, or even data are there, the data that are sort of verified by the national government, but then how does it even kind of work together, or the integration with the subnational government, whose data might be perhaps on the level of the national not verified, or it might be a project-based or smaller data, but the ownership is sometimes, I think there's always like pointing fingers, right? And especially when it comes to budget or limited funding, that's where I think the challenge is exacerbated. So I think those are perhaps something that I could share in terms of VLR or localizing the SDGs, communication between local and national government, the vertical and horizontal integration of the SDGs are quite still a challenge, because there's no, I see, ownership in all of the work. So I think I will stop my sharing there, and I'll hand it back to Shirin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's great to hear your perspectives, and it kind of like reminds me of the issue that we sometimes hear in these panels, like when we compare what we might call the global north or the global south, or developing countries. A lot of the challenges are actually very similar. The way they exhibit themselves and the scale of challenges might be different in different contexts, but the nature of them, sometimes they're very similar. So the issue of ownership, for example, that you mentioned, seems to be a challenge in other contexts as well, not just in the Asia Pacific. Thanks for that. So finally, we have Marius Kirsten, who is joining us from Switzerland, and I hand over to you to share your reflections on the work on SDG implementation at the subnational level.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shirin, for inviting me. Also to Basil and Domi for organizing this here. As you said, Shirin, I sit in Switzerland. I also collaborate with Basil at the University of Basel in a research project where we ask how does sustainability get or come into public administration and government. But now here I'm talking as a manager of a network of cantonal sustainability offices. So that's more my practice perspective on these questions. And I think so much was already said, very important and very interesting aspects that I can really link to my experiences. I will first present briefly this network of cantonal sustainability offices in Switzerland, and then kind of share my general thoughts on SDG implementation. So, Domi, if you can go to the next slide. Very briefly, we're a network of 22 cantons in Switzerland. Cantons, that's the subnational level in Switzerland. There are 26 cantons in Switzerland, actually, and 22 are members of our association. So this is a quite newly built association, formally established 1 year ago, but we had a kind of a pilot with some of the cantons for around 3 years before. So next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the aims of this network? It's mostly about sharing and learning from each other, collaboration, establishing collaboration between the cantons, but also having a communication channel from the national level to the subnational level. And then also from the cantons to the municipalities. So it's a kind of a communication network above all, exchanging experiences and learning from each other, but also supporting each other on a technical level. So that's the learning aspect, but also kind of on a strategic level to speak with one voice. We have the 22 cantons, which have in Switzerland quite a lot of legal competences, so they can speak from one voice towards the national level, the federal level. That quite nicely links to what just Rebecca said, this integration from of the national and the subnational perspective. How do they come together? And you mentioned that as vertical integration. That's one of our main tasks that we do, but also, as I will just say in a minute, one of our main challenges, of course. So next slide. Thank you. So our learnings, that we have really a lot of diversity of SDG implementation on the subnational level in Switzerland. That quite nicely links to what Brett said before. We need tailored and very specific approaches. There's no one solution that fits it all. There are very diverse political strategies. We see some cantons that really orient their strategic planning towards the SDGs, and we have other subnational entities that have no interest or very few interests in the SDGs. Maybe they use the SDGs as a means of communication, and I think this is also nicely linking to what you, Brett, said before, that the SDGs work as a framing concept. We can use this in many different ways, and we can communicate on the one hand side the specific goals, the idea of the SDGs, but on the other hand side, we can also communicate the system of the SDGs. So it's kind of a new thinking that comes in, and the awareness that the SDGs or different strategic goals, be it the SDGs or other political goals, are interconnected, and that we need to include stakeholders. So participation is important, or that we need to collaborate with the municipalities. So these new ways of thinking, I think, is a very important aspect of the whole 2030 agenda and the SDGs. So it's not only about the specific goals, but it's kind of a new thinking that comes in. And that links quite nicely to the first enabler I want to mention here. I think there are many enablers, and we can learn a lot from the subnational level how to implement the SDGs. But one enabler that we see here in Switzerland is that the personal awareness, so the education also, this new kind of thinking is very important, and the motivation of the administrators or of the experts in the field is very important. And here also the university, of course, plays a specific role, because that's where people are educated. So our education systems, I think, here are important enabling. And the challenge I want to mention, I think it's quite the same that Rebecca just mentioned. It's the horizontal cooperation, so the communication between the subnational entities, the cantons in Switzerland. We have quite a nice tool now with this association that I work for that facilitated communication between the cantons quite a lot. But there's still the challenge of vertical cooperation. So how do we align the national perspective with the subnational perspectives? And here we really have a plurality. There are questions of legal competences, who has which competence, how do we align different political strategies, who steers this whole system? Is it a centralized organization, or is it decentralized? In Switzerland, we have a strong federalism, so everything is decentralized. And how do we steer a decentralized system? That's quite a challenge. So that's from my side. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Marius, for your great contributions as well. So considering that we don't have much time, I will really quickly ask just one question, and then we can see what question we have from the audience in the next part. So for my question, I guess one of the key themes that I'm really interested in is, as you have seen at the midterm review of the SDGs, acceleration is really emerging as a key theme. We are having it as a key theme of the Global Sustainable Development Report that will be launched at the UN in a week, and also the SDG Summit that kicks off in a few days from now is also having acceleration as a key theme of it. But my question is, really, what does acceleration look like for subnational SDG implementation? And as we really think about the 2030 and the timeline that we have from now till then, what does it take really to move beyond incremental actions and engage with more transformative modes of SDG implementation at the subnational level? I'm not sure if there is anyone who wants to tackle that question first. Maybe Jessica, given that you were the first to speak, do you want to very briefly have your answer?
I think that's a really tricky question, and will obviously differ considerably depending on the context, because obviously, yeah, well, all different urban environments will be struggling with different aspects of the agenda. I mean, I think I go back to what I said before, which is that, and not to sound a bit like a broken record, is that we're not going to accelerate, we're not going to affect transformative new policies and practices unless there's sort of a real convergence of different knowledge actors and different policy actors working together. And I think that we need a sort of new way of working essentially is required, that's not just being left to city officials who are often ill-capacitated and so on, but actually are working with third-party stakeholders to provide the expertise and support that's required. So I think I'd probably say that. The other thing I'd just like to plug, while I have a minute, if I can, is just also on the global side. And I know that this is sort of really zooming out, but I think one of the challenges we face at the moment with really encouraging national and international system, national governments and local governments to really accelerate progress, is that there is still today grossly insufficient recognition at that global level of the kind of transformative impacts of planetary urbanization. There's more and more references to cities, there's more and more references to the urban scale, but there's very little recognition of the fact that actually urban system dynamics are fundamentally changing the scope of the planet, right? And the nature of the planet, I mean. And if you see it, for example, in the fact that we've just had a scientific advisory group established for the Secretary General, it's just been announced, and there's no one in that group who's an urbanist, and there's no one in that group who can offer that kind of, well, let's talk about health, let's talk about education, let's talk about all these other public sector issues and concerns, but let's do it also with an urban lens, because otherwise you're completely missing a lot of the sort of geographic dynamics and complex dynamics happening at that scale. So I think that there's a bit of a blind spot in global policy, which is affecting national policy and the prioritization given to accelerating implementation subnationally, which is just really recognizing that actually this is systemic and fundamental. And if you're not actually thinking about it at every level of governance, you're never really going to affect transformative change, because it's just going to be piecemeal interventions with insufficient funding, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of what my work's focused on at the moment, but I think it's a really crucial issue and a real blind spot in global policy. So wanted to mention it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Anyone else from the panel would like to tackle that question?
I can just make a couple of points, Shirin. So our whole premise of this work that we've been doing is that if we can do a good job for a few local areas, local regions, diversely selected with diverse issues, and we can make it work, then others would see that, other regions, and they would come to us and say, oh, can you do it for us? Can you do it for us? And it would generate its own momentum as one region saw the benefits that others have had, and they all wanted to get on the bus. That has and hasn't worked. Firstly, I think we've got to strike the right issue. So we've got to pick that priority issue that's already made it onto the public consciousness, that people either see as a threat, see as an opportunity. Here, fires and floods from climate change were very effective in motivating the Marybeck City Council in Melbourne's northern suburbs to want to do something. And its residents were worried. What's going to happen to the most vulnerable in our community? Is my house going to flood? Am I going to lose power? Are there going to be, all these things from climate change? So it's in the front of mind, and they're worried. The second thing is that engagement and local knowledge co-production, working with locals, is important, but you need to use the right method. So we'd used methods, and people would sort of come along because either they had promised a friend, or that it was part of their job and they had to attend the meeting or something. But, and they'd engage, but to a limited extent, until we used what we call a serious game. So we had game designers make up a collaborative and cooperative game about adapting to climate change, and played it with Marybeck Council. And it was a complete light bulb moment for us. They loved it. It led to subsequent workshops hosted by the mayor, highlight videos of the whole exercise. Other councils have now come. The thing that we had originally wanted, that other areas would come and say, please come and run this with us, is actually happening. And not simply because I think it's a fun experience. It's a way of engaging with their local people in a fun way, that they go away, they have a positive experience, they come out with better connected with their local communities, they come out with an idea about what's going to happen under climate change and how they can avoid or adapt. And that to me, the way that we engage was a transformative moment. I think it holds a key.
Thank you so much, Brett. Really interesting to see. Maybe you should join one of your workshops when you're doing one of those serious games and see what the trick is. I'm really mindful that we are almost running out of time. Well, we are actually 2 minutes over. But I would still like to give a chance to anyone else from the panel if they want to really mention something on that question really, really briefly. Otherwise, I'm aware that there have been a few questions in the chat, but they were more targeted towards our working group rather than the panel. So for some final words from the panel, if there is anyone who wants to make a comment. Yes, please, go ahead, Marius.
Maybe just one last thought from my side that pops up quite often we didn't mention yet. At the very end of the day, it's the political will. I collaborate with the administrators and they're deciding a lot. They have competences, but at the very end, it's their officials, it's their chiefs, the political actors that decide whether we go into the direction of the SDGs or not. And that's just a limit if we talk on from a expert perspective. At least here in Switzerland, experts, that's just one voice. You mentioned that, Jessica, that we have to bring them in and maybe also to shape the political landscape. But at the very end, it's politics. So.
Exactly, and I think that was also one of the questions that we had in the Q&A before regarding how this initiative can help achieve the much needed political solutions given other solutions. So it's, I think, more targeted towards our group. And I can just maybe very briefly say that actually one of the answers, not all of us in this working group are political scientists, but some of us are. And there are questions related to political sciences that we are also really trying to include and integrate into the way we think about SDG implementation at the subnational level. So if you're interested, I really encourage you to get in touch with us and hear more about the work that we are doing in this working group. I also see one question from Thomas on that is probably more targeted towards the panel. And that is about the role of us as researchers in localizing the SDGs. I'll just read the question out loud. It seems to me that there are various important roles to play, adopting a critical perspective on what happens with the SDGs at the local level, exploring hindering or enabling conditions, as well as success factors, providing expertise to local administration. Would perhaps be nice for a working group to compile an overview of work in progress. Yes, I agree with that, and I think some of the work that we have been doing at Monash was also really trying to look at these different modes of engagement with the SDGs at the local level, and trying to really understand what is happening at the local level, and really exploring the issues that are really ongoing on the ground. So we agree. And let's take that on board as well in the way we work forward. If there are no other burning questions in the room, I think we might just try to close it here, given that we are already over time and people in the Northern Hemisphere might have other things to go to. So thanks really for joining us, and please feel free to get in touch with us if you're interested in the work of the working group that we are doing. This webinar will be online, and also feel free to engage with their System Governance SDG Taskforce more broadly for the rest of the work that they're doing on SDG implementation at different levels, including global governance, national, but also businesses and private sector on the SDGs. And on that note, have a great day and evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.